Opening statement on behalf of defense.
Thank you. Please support, counsel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
As I said yesterday, in many respects, this trial is not going to be so much about what was done, but why it was done and whether or not it's justified. We believe the evidence is going to clearly show that beginning back in August, essentially August 3rd, and as Mr. Respis indicated in his opening, basically a relative had left a cooler with some food and some gifts for Ava Woodward for her 12th birthday. And these presents in this cooler disappeared. And the Woodward family suspected, because of some other events that had happened in the neighborhood, fairly or unfairly, suspected that Gary Hambree's daughter had taken it. And rather than go over and confront, etc., because they didn't want there to be, Mr. Woodward called and made a report to the police and asked the police to come over, and he said he believed he knew where the property was. And the police officer and Mr. Woodward went over, and Mr. Woodward explained why he felt his daughter's property had been stolen. And Mr. Hembree got very upset about it. And Mr. Woodward turned to the police officer and said, "Look, I'm just going to drop it and go home." But that wasn't good enough for Mr. Hembree. Mr. Hembree, he acted basically, challenging Mr. Woodward to a fight, wanting to fight him, couldn't get you, etc., etc. Now, up until this point in time, Mr. Hembree and Mr. Woodward had been friends. You're going to hear, the evidence will show, that there had been situations when Mr. Hembree was out of work, Mr. Blake was out of work, that Mr. Woodward actually helped them with their rent, considered them friends. Particularly, you're going to hear that he considered Mr. Hembree a friend. So he was hurt and shocked when Mr. Hembree reacted so negatively to this rather than just deal with it. And more importantly, that he not only turned on Mr. Woodward and his family, but encouraged the Blakes and Pecor, and later on, other people, to do that as well. And that the first act of spite was, let's say, the chickens. Now, you're going to hear that Mr. Woodward raised this flock of chickens and actually called them his therapy chickens. And he'd had them for about 2 years. And the neighborhood children played with them. His kids played with them. The Hembree children had played and come over and enjoyed these things. And there had been no problem for 2 years. But Mr. Hembree decided, because he believed that he could, and successfully did, in fact, get code enforcement he took pictures, reported this, and taunted Mr. Woodward about that. And yes, Mr. Woodward said, look, you got a problem with me? Come on out. Come out in the street. We'll take care of it. And Mr. Hembree said, you come into my yard. We'll fight. It wasn't that he was declining the invitation to fight. He just wanted to get Mr. Woodward on his property. I guess to gain some sort of advantage or be able to claim something otherwise. And so there's this back and forth, and both sides walk away. Now, at that point in time, Mr. Woodward, at least according to what he told after the event, was finished with it. But unfortunately, Mr. Hembree, Mr. Pecor, the Blakes, their Hembree's girlfriend, had enlisted their children. For a period of a month, virtually every day, there was some sort of harassment. Now, some of the most egregious that occurred during confrontation, and it came from basically, the biggest threats were from Carrie Blake and Kim Cass. As Mr. Respis referred to them, the women in this. And during one of these harassment, it got to the point where Kim Blake threatened to have Ava Gardner, 12 years old, kidnapped and anally raped by a big black guy. She threatened to burn their house while they slept. Now, she was the people making the threats, but her actions were being adopted and continued on through the taunts and threats after it was made. Now, the basic reaction that Mr. Woodward had was admittedly pretty significant at the time these threats to his daughter were made, these threats to his family were made. Because he considered them real, he considered them credible, and he worried about it. And he told them in no uncertain terms, you do anything to my family, I will eviscerate you. And he did that. He said that. Now, as the harassment continued, the Woodward family turned to law enforcement to try and get some relief and some protection from it. And law enforcement would come then, and there would be differing accounts of what happened and didn't happen. He said, she said, and the upshot of law enforcement when they would report when these threats were made was, well, we can't really do anything because we don't know. And finally it was suggested that the Woodwards, you're telling us these things happen, we need proof of them, why don't you put up a surveillance camera? So Billy Woodward and his father, a retired Titusville police officer, set up a surveillance camera. And they directed this camera. You'll hear testimony as how they focused it. They focused it on where the harassment was coming from. Essentially, right down that corridor of the Hembrys and the Blakes. And the core is part of that. Because it is that, for want of a better term, gang, who is conducting this. And again, this is, at this point in time, this is an everyday occurrence. You will hear from Ava, 12-year-old, that she was taunted. And the Blake parents encouraged their children. And every day, she and her brother, who was about 5 years old at that point in time, were taunted in the neighborhood, on the bus to school, even at school. Various reports. And again, the Woodwards would make reports of this, ask for relief. The system could not help. And it got to the point where the Woodwards filed for an injunction. And immediately, the Blake, Pecors, and Hembrys filed a counter injunction. And claims and counterclaims. Now, one of the things that you will hear the night that it happened is what these people's, what I'm referring to as the core Hembry Blake gang attitude was toward law enforcement. Because they actually caught on surveillance talking about, well, what if the police come? No problem. We'll just lie about it. We can handle that. Which is essentially what you'll hear from the Woodwards was the pattern every time the Woodwards complained about these people's constant harassment against them. The claim of them is, oh, well, it was just as bad from the Woodwards. But interestingly enough, after the surveillance camera is put up and we really have a record of this, we still have days of harassment by the gang. And nothing is ever captured by the Woodwards retaliating. retaliating even verbally during this whole period of time. So we have this long body of work, and there are different times where there's harassment, and they call the police. And again, the Woodwards say, come, look at our surveillance. And the police officer said, no thanks, we're not going to do that. And no sooner do the police leave than it starts up again. And that becomes a pattern of behavior. And essentially the Woodward family are at a point where they feel like they're prisoners in their own home. They cannot go out of their own house. They can't have their parents over because the abuse is going to be directed at them, because it had expanded by this time against Billy, Barbara, their children, and their parents, because their parents. Other neighbors in the neighborhood who were offended by the behavior also caught the ire of the Blake Hembry Picayune gang and were subjected to abuse. But the focus of their activity, the evidence will show, and their common purpose, that they all were principals in furthering their common purpose, was to break Billy Woodward. They believed that he was vulnerable. They denigrated his military service. They believed that he had PTSD, so they taunted him about that. And openly bragged to other people, we're going to break him. We're going to get him. We're going to make him snap. That was their purpose for a full month. Well, the Woodwards couldn't live with this anymore and actually made plans to move out of the neighborhood. And Labor Day, September 3rd, was widely known to be their last night in the neighborhood. And as what the state is saying is like this nice little Labor Day party. Just some people getting together for a barbecue and a few beers and a little bit of fun. The evidence will show that the fun was constant harassment and credible threats against the Woodward family. And it started even before Billy Woodward and his wife, Barbara, went out to dinner that night, and their parents babysat. And people across the street weren't really aware of that, so they were continuing to direct insults, threats, etc., as was common at that point in time, even before Billy came home. But where we believe the most significant evidence really starts is about 9 o'clock, when the Woodwards returned home. Mr. Woodward Sr., Billy's dad, had explained some of the stuff that had happened really well they're outside to him, and kind of filled him in on what had happened that evening. And so that kind of heightened his concern. And he sat inside his house. And quite honestly, it had become almost a pattern of they were watching the surveillance cameras because they were concerned constantly about what was going to happen. And Barbara Woodward was at the point, she's going to testify, she'll tell you about the emotional distress this conduct of behavior had on her and her children and all that. And she was essentially a nervous wreck at that point in time. And she decided that the only way she was going to sleep that night was to take sleeping pills. And that's what she did. She took medication and she went to sleep. And fortunately, to a certain extent, the 5-year-old little boy, Ethan, he was somewhat more resilient and kind of unaware of this. So he was able to go to sleep as well. But Ava was hearing. And one of the things, it is going to be, I suggest, difficult to hear everything on the surveillance camera and microphone. And that's partially a problem with the equipment, and some of this is far away. There's some things that will be really clear. There are some things that you may have to listen to more than once and hear. Some of the things were admitted by people in prior testimony. They said or did that or observed other people saying or doing it. But the distinction is what you can hear on the surveillance is what the camera took place. The camera and the microphone are the silent witness in this case, the evidence will show. But there are live witnesses who are in a position to hear this live. And one of them is, at that time, 12-year-old Ava, who was hearing these threats, which I'm going to go into a little more detail of what you can hear even from the surveillance. But hearing, and she was scared. And she took her fears to her father. And she was afraid that these people were going to come and hurt her and hurt her family. And she was aware of this pattern of harassment, and she had been subjected to it. And she was genuinely concerned. And that caused an even greater concern on the behalf of Billy Woodward. And so he urged her to go to bed, told her it would be okay, and actually thought that she had, in fact, gone to bed, and that she, like her brother, had been able to sleep through the events that occurred. We're going to hear from Ava's testimony that actually wasn't true. But even from inside her bedroom, she could still hear the things that not only Tim Blake, not only Roger Pecor, not only Gary Hembry, but by this time, you've got Carrie Blake, you've got Kim Cass, you've got another half a dozen people, young adults, almost adults, children, probably 15 to 25 people, all at various times joining in this entertainment of harassing and threatening the Woodward family. From 9 o'clock to about 1:45, an almost 4-hour period, virtually everyone at this party decides to get in on the fun and harass, threaten, and actually act out threatening behavior to the Woodward family. So once Ava had expressed her fears, and once Mr. Woodward, Billy, had thought that he had calmed her down and sent her to bed, at this point he decides that just watching what's going on from inside the house is not enough. And he does, in fact. The evidence is going to show typically he, at this point in time, he wore camouflage clothing all the time, but he's wearing camouflage clothing. He arms himself, and he takes a position of surveillance in his own yard. Now, he does this because he doesn't want them to know. Because what had been happening since 9 o'clock, I mean, sort of the start of the festivities that Mr. Woodward was greeted with when he got back and went inside his house, is we've got Roger Pecor. And the surveillance camera is going to show pretty clearly that Roger Pecor, he decides to serenade the family with essentially his version of Charlie Daniels' A Simple Man, modifying the lyrics to appropriate. And those lyrics basically are, I'd take a big tall tree and a short piece of rope I'd hang him high and I'd let him swing until the sun goes down, screaming, "I ain't going to take no shit," as he stands across from the Woodward home and directs this to the Woodwards. And he continues to say, "In my house, I got a 12-gauge shotgun waiting on the other side. I'm going to put him on the knees, tie him to the stump. We're going to fight." And then he alters the lyrics to say, "And blow him the fuck away." Bam! Now, he pauses, pleased with himself, and then begins singing again. "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You better watch where you go and remember where you've been. That's the way I see it. I'm a simple man." And then he returns to the party, because he's had his fun for the moment. But made it clear what his attitude is. And that's the first thing that Billy Woodward views as a credible threat. Because you have to consider, and what the evidence will show, is that this isn't something that occurred in a vacuum. This is accumulation of a month's worth of harassment and threats to rape his daughter, and one of the most important threats to remember that have been made on more than one occasion during this month is to burn their house while they sleep. Now, at this point in time, Billy was essentially inside the house. And there's some other conversation. He comes out, and they have some different stuff. And Mr. Woodward's parents leave. There's some discussion as they're leaving outside. Can only catch parts of it. But it becomes fairly clear, even though the surveillance camera didn't pick up the full conversation, that basically what they were discussing was what had occurred before and what had just occurred in terms of Roger McCoy. And one of the things that you need to recognize about the three males that were directing most of their ire toward Mr. Woodward and his family is all of them are significantly physically bigger than Mr. Woodward. Mr. Pecor went about 275, 280. He was a big, big man. Hembry was over 200 pounds. Tim Blake, you'll see him. He's pretty bad, say 210, 220 as well at this point in time. Mr. Woodward, probably 165, soaking wet. So just from a physical point of view, these three people were physically more imposing than Mr. Woodward. Now, a bunch of stuff happens during the next 3 hours. And I'm not going to get into all of it, but it tends to ebb and flow. But what is happening is varying people that are involved over at this house. We've moved from a gang, essentially, to a mob. And some of the behavior that the mob, you can hear at various points in time, some of them, frighteningly enough, are talking about making a bomb and blowing stuff up. They talk about guns. Getting guns. Do you have guns? Yes, I have guns. That's concerning as well, because these are things that Mr. Woodward can hear. And he believes that they're talking about things that they're gathering in terms of his family. And later on in the night, Tim Blake and Roger Pecor and Gary Hembry come on down. And at this point, the entertainment is trying to get Mr. Woodward to come out of his house and fight him. And you can hear them. They talk about basically what the plan is. We're going to get him. And, Tim Blake brags to his confederate. Get him out here. I'll fight him to the death. Look at how white my uncles are. I can do it. I can fight him to the death. And what they don't know is they think they're having a conversation, or kind of oblivious to the fact that their conversation is loud enough that it's being picked up by the surveillance camera. But more importantly, they are not aware of the fact that they are being surveilled from a much closer thing. But Billy Woodward's already out. And he's listening to them. And listening to them talk about, if we can just get him out in the street, then essentially we can beat him to death. And at different points in time, they come down with things. One of them comes down with a big pipe. And you can hear as they're making their threats and taunts. They're pounding this pipe on the ground. Some of the taunts are, the mooning, sexual references, talking about doing this and that sexually, which, again, reawakens these earlier threats to have things done to Mr. Woodward's daughter in Mr. Woodward's mind. Some of them are just kids running around. One of their favorite themes were to taunt and remind Mr. Woodward about their success in having the chickens removed. And they would scream, "Eat more chicken!" and make references to the chickens. Again, it's a taunt. And some of that is childish. And some of that is not even Mr. Woodward at that point in time considered so much as a threat. It's just an escalation of the fact that it wasn't just an isolated person challenging or threatening his family. It was a mob across the street that were all joining in it and escalating. And then some of it gets a little more frightening. Because, again, keeping in context the earlier threat to burn their house while they slept, and his wife and son, and he believes his daughter, are asleep in the house. Groups of them come down, and they light torches. And they burn what appears to be a sheet in front of them, while chanting, "White power, burn, baby, burn." Which, again, reawakens in Mr. Woodward's mind the concern he takes as a credible threat. Now, even at this point in time, in the face of this provocation, Mr. Woodward does not act because he is waiting to see whether or not what he views as a credible threat and threats is going to escalate into imminent action. Okay? Now, he doesn't use those words in his mind and as he describes it. Those are words that I've plucked from the statute. Because, as you've already heard, there is what the evidence will show and the law will show in this, is there is a right to use deadly force in certain situations in the state of Florida. That's a statutory right. And one of the issues in this case is, did Mr. Woodward fall under the statute? So part of the decision that the jury is going to make, and what we believe the evidence will clearly show, is first and foremost was there forcible felonies that Mr. Woodward was concerned about. Now, there were a number of potential forcible felonies that rose to the level of a credible threat. Because keep in mind, he could clearly hear these threats to, if we can get him out of the house, we're going to fight him to the death. From a gang of people at this point in time that certainly had the physical capability, forget weaponry, just had the physical capability to beat him to death. And the evidence is going to show that Mr. Woodward was aware of the fact that they had access to firearms. As a matter of fact, Mr. Woodward, because he had been friends with this family, Roger Pecor identified himself on his Facebook page with this picture of him pointing an AK-47 at the camera as if he was shooting a picture painter. That was his identity photo on Facebook. That was the image he wanted to portray. And the Woodward family was certainly familiar with that. And, as the evidence is going to show, the surveillance picks up at different times. People talking about, do you have a gun? Do you use a gun? Yes, I've got a gun. So, again, the seeds are being planted not only from past experience and past knowledge, but that particular evening, right then, that one or more of these people may be armed. And as Mr. Woodward sits and watches in a position where he can protect his family, but does not act, even in the face of all of this provocation, which you're going to hear, and any reasonable person would say is disgusting and totally beyond the pale, just in terms of provocation, he does not act. Because at that point in time, it has not moved from mere words to imminent action. But he hears, and he files away, and he sees the action. And these drunken revelers across, as I said, we've got not just the three people who were shot, but we have participation at some point and at some level in virtually everybody who is across the street, from children through teenagers, through young adults, through the owners of the property. And it is active participation and encouragement of participation from these different people. And then we get to a variety, and you're going to hear this, and again, I'm not going to go through all of the stuff, but he hears different things, and he hears different things that they're talking about, hitting, dads, different type of stuff, which isn't really clear, but is heightening his threat awareness. Because he's not really sure what they're talking about, but what they're talking about in any context is not just casual, normal, fun-type activities. There's an edge of violence to what he's hearing. And Mr. Woodward believes clearly at this point, because of all of the bile and threats that have been directed to his family, that they're talking about what they plan to do to him and his wife and his children. Now, some of these people are going to say, oh no, we were talking about other things. We were just playing around. We were playing a game where, if you lose, the penalty is we're going to shoot you. When we're talking about shooting, we were talking about, popping people with this or that, or shooting them with this, and it had nothing to do with the Woodwards. But again, you have to recognize the context of these things, that even if what they're saying is true, the words have meaning. And the issue is, under the law, whether or not a reasonable person would believe that the threat is real. Because the law is very clear. The threat does not actually have to be real. The law is very clear that the people making the threats don't even have to have the intention to carry out the threats. It is the perception on the person against who the threats are being made that the law looks at. And whether or not that perception is reasonable under the circumstances. And this gets to the point where, after a number of things, Mr. Woodward hears gunshots on multiple occasions. And at this point in time, he's clear in his mind that these are gunshots. And this is a confirmation to him of what he's heard earlier when they talked about guns, about getting a gun, they have a gun, that they have a gun, they're willing to use it. And then he hears the things that chill his blood. He essentially hears them talking about, come on, let's get up, let's do it, we're going to do it. And he hears a woman's voice he believes to be carried away. Scream out, oh my God, they're really going to do it. Now keep in mind the context. Carrie Blake is the person who's made the most vital threats against his family. She is the person who directs the most vile and is the agitator to all this. And so when he hears her confirm they're really going to do it in conjunction with, come on, get up, let's go, let's do it. Now we've moved from a credible threat to an imminent threat. And you will see that immediately after those words are uttered, you first start seeing Mr. Woodward get into camera range. And he acts. And yes, indeed, he does act. Now, I think it's going to be important. You're going to actually hear the sequence of gunshots in this. It's pretty clear on the surveillance. And what you will also hear in terms of Mr. Woodward's prior statements to the police, prior testimony, and we anticipate testimony sometime during this trial. You'll hear him say that the first thing that he sees as he's come across is he sees Roger McClure there with a couple of other younger people. Now, one of the things you will hear is that Mr. Woodward's particular mindset is women and children are non-combatants. Adult males are the combatants in this situation. And yes, he does use language. He believes that he is in a wartime setting. He is in a combat mode. And how he addresses this is consistent with his prior training and his stealth mode and all of this type of thing. And he uses some pretty specific language, in terms of what his mindset was. But he will tell you, as he approaches that, he sees Roger McClure, 280-pound Roger McClure, and Roger McClure's got a baseball bat in his hand. And he believes, at that point in time, based on what he's heard, that Roger McClure is leading the charge to his house. And that they're encouraging all of the people, even the people that he actually considers non-combatants, to kind of join in the mob attack of his house. The burning of his house. They've already demonstrated clearly their willingness to burn various things at various times. And as I said, the most outrageous one was they were burning the sheet and shouting insults and threats toward his family. So again, there's no doubt in his mind that what he is looking at possibly directed at his family would be aggravated assault, which is a forcible felony, possible aggravated battery, that's hitting, touching, striking with a weapon, Roger McClure. He's already heard the gunshots, so he believes that one or more of these people may be armed. He's already heard the threats to beat him specifically to death if they can get him out of his house. So again, he's worried about those things. He's worried about arson because of their burning different things. Now, while he does not articulate it, if you look to the list of the statutory things that someone is justified in using deadly force to prevent, as lawyers we understand that the forcible felony, which is most apparent and is actually being committed virtually from 9 o'clock all the way to 12:40, is aggravated stalking. It is a forcible felony under the law. If you follow the law, a person is entitled to use deadly force, and the law makes no distinction between one gunshot or 31 in terms of deadly force. You can use that to prevent the commission of aggravated stalking. So there's a legal justification for his actions well before he acts. But Mr. Woodward, the evidence will show, waited until he felt that the threat against his family was imminent. And that's when he acted. So he rounds the corner, he sees Roger Pecor, this giant of a man with a baseball bat in his hand, heading toward his property, and he shoots him in the head. And a couple of seconds later, you hear the second shot. Now keep in mind, there's going to be some conflicts in the testimony in terms of the sequence of shot or who shot one. Listen very closely to the gunshot pattern, because I suggest to you that that will show what the sequence is. And Roger Pecor is shot twice in the head. And then there's a pause. And at this point in time, the person who is shot is Tim Blake. Bruce Tim Blake. The reason that we use Tim is because if you hear names and hear different things, Tim is what he typically went through. Bruce Timothy Blake is his correct name. And throughout this trial, you may hear him referred to as Bruce Blake or Tim Blake or Mr. Blake. But that's the person. And he's the person who was shot and survived. And you will hear from the evidence that Mr. Woodward, seeing him and seeing him in the shadows, saw him and believed that he may be armed, believed that he may be the person with the firearm. And he essentially emptied his clip into it. You hear 13 shots in rapid fire. Bang, 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 bang. Okay? And Mr. Blake went down, and Mr. Woodward thought he was dead. That's what he told the police later. And at that point, because he still has all of these different people, keep in mind, he's one against many at this point. And people are running around. And people are going and running and hiding and shouting and screaming. And you hear a lot of that as well. But he puts in the second clip. And then Gary Hembry comes out of his house. And it's unclear from Mr. Woodward's perspective. He has sensed, he had actually, when Mr. Blake hit the ground, he had seen, at that point in time, I believe the evidence from his testimony is that he was looking for the gun that he believed Mr. Blake had, because he wanted to make sure that that was not accessible to anybody else. And he came to the realization that what he thought was the gun was actually a metal cup or mug type thing, and that's what he had seen and believed to be the gun. So at that point, he came to the realization that Mr. Blake did not have a weapon. And he sees Mr. Hembry come out, and again, it's not clear. He sees Mr. Hembry reaching as if to have a weapon, and he shoots him. Again, multiple times, and basically empties a second clip. Because under the stress and the adrenaline and everything else, he just keeps firing until the gun is empty. At that point in time, he recognizes that the gun is empty. He does tell the police that if he had had more bullets, he would have made sure that Mr. Blake was indeed deceased, because he wanted to eliminate the threat. And he had believed at that point in time, my words, not his, that he had cut the head off the snake of the mob. And he walks back to his home. And as he walks back to his home, one of his other neighbors calls out to him and says, Billy, Billy, are you all right? And he calls out, yes, I'm all right. I got him all. You'll hear that on Mr. Van's thing. And he goes and he kneels in his driveway, puts firearm, now empty, in front of him. He put his hands above his head. Because he knows from his father's experience, and stories and things like that, when police arrive, he wants to be in a non-threatening situation. And at this point, he's almost preternaturally calm, given the situation. Because as he expresses, as the police comes up, the war is over. He tells them that he had to act, that his family would have been in body bags, that he had not. And you hear various different conversations as they take him into custody and take him away. The evidence will show that a little later on that evening, Mr. Woodward consented to an interview by a female officer at the Titusville Police Department, where he explained what he and his family had been going through, what his thought process was, why he felt he was compelled to act, and what he did. And you'll get to see, because this is a video-recorded interview, you can see the range of emotions that go through that. And he explains to that officer, why he chose not to take out any of the people that he considered innocents or collateral damage, that it was part of his life experience, his training, that women. You'll hear him talk in very strong terms about Carrie Blake and his disdain, almost hate for her and what she had done and threatened and done in his family. But in the same breath, he's talking about, why didn't you shoot her? She's a woman. She's not a threat. I only eliminated the threat. That's his mindset. The younger people, even though they were participating in these acts that were threats against his family, they were off the table in terms of combatants in his mind. So he didn't deal with them. At the end of the evidence, and there's going to be a lot more things, there's going to be some things when we're talking about, he concedes that he learned that after he shot them that they were unarmed. But keep in mind, unarmed at that moment in time does not mean capable of being armed and still being a threat to him in the situation, because you're going to see some photographs that show different things that certainly are accessible to this mob in terms of weaponry. One of the most impressive is something that Tim Blake created, which he calls a shark killer. Apparently he uses this chain and ball with these spikes on it to bludgeon sharks to death. And that's hanging off the grill there. And there's different points in time in the photographs you can see sharpened pipes and things like that that have been sharpened to almost spears. And we learned after the fact that Roger Picour had a folding knife in his possession that kind of fell out of his pocket while they were taking him to the hospital things. And again, just the guns. Some point in time, gunshots, what I would suggest to you, clearly are gunshots. There's distinctive here. To talk about the bombs, to talk about the other things. There's plenty of reason for a reasonable person to conclude that any member of this mob had the apparent ability to carry out their threats. Certainly had the ability to carry out their threats to beat him to death. Certainly had the capability and demonstrated the capability to burn his family home as they slept. And if you hear the gunshots, certainly had the capability to engage in a gunfight. At the end of all of this, the decision, I think the evidence is going to be absolutely clear that Mr. Woodward was acting in what he believed was defense of himself and family. Part of the decisions you're going to have to make is whether or not he used excessive force. Again, we believe the evidence will clearly show that he did not, based on what he believed. But even if he did use excessive force, that would be a manslaughter. That there is no premeditation. In fact, the very things that the state is using, the evidence will show, as evidence of premeditation are actually the fact that he held back and did not react in anger or revenge or to the taunting. He waited until he believed that the threat was imminent. The very thing that the statute requires him to do. And we believe at the end of the case, it will clearly show that while he had every reason to have ill will and an emotional response to what had been directed toward him and his family over a period of months, that when you hear his explanation to law enforcement the night of the event, it will be clear that that is not what he was acting out of. So it's not second-degree murder. It's not premeditated murder. It's not second-degree murder. It's not even really manslaughter because his acts were purely justified under the law. Mr. Woodward acted because he felt that he had no choice. He acted because the system that he had been trained to rely upon failed him on many, many occasions. He called the police. The police were unable to do anything and protect his family. He sought relief from the courts for protection, and he was denied. Einstein once famously said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Well, Mr. Woodward was not insane. Mr. Woodward knew at the point that he acted that the police would be unable to protect his family. More likely, they would not protect his family. That even their presence would only delay, not stop, because it had been demonstrated, as the evidence will show, to him over and over, and particularly this night. At one point in the night, the police do show up, and everything quietens down. In fact, just as the police are driving into the neighborhood, you hear a honk from over at the Hembury, and everything goes quiet there. And the police car drives around, and then just as soon as it's leaving, starts back up. Now, Mr. Woodward knew in that situation he could not rely upon law enforcement to protect his family or the system to protect his family. And he acted because he had to act. The evidence will show he was justified in what he did.